welcome to this explainer. Today, we're cutting straight through the political noise to track how the administration's actions from the week of July 17th to July 23rd, 2026 are literally going to reach right into your wallets, your workplaces, and your constitutional rights. We're going to map out the real-world ripple effects of these policy shifts. We'll look at who actually wins here, and more importantly, who ends up holding the bag.
We've got a really packed agenda today. We're covering rebuilding the global tariff, the escalation in the Iran war, the weakening of civil rights enforcement, the contesting of FEMA election grants, and an overhaul of defense supply chains. The common thread here? Executive substitution, and we're going to see exactly who absorbs the costs of that shift.
All right, let's dive right into our first topic, rebuilding the global tariff.
So remember when the Supreme Court struck down the administration's attempt to use emergency powers for a global tariff floor? Well, that wasn't the end of the story. On July 23rd, the administration basically swapped out that invalidated emergency tariff with a completely different legal tool. They directed new tariffs of 10 to 12.5%, this time using Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. The official justification, formal findings that 60 different economies aren't doing enough to prohibit forced labor. So the label on the box says forced labor, but the actual mechanism is a border tax scheduled to kick in the exact second the old temporary tariffs expire. Now, this number right here is absolutely crucial, 99.4%. That is the percentage of U.S. imports covered by this new replacement floor. Just think about the scale of that for a second. We're not talking about a surgical strike on a couple of bad actors. This is an economy-wide net. Because it's a tariff, U.S. importers are the ones who legally pay this tax at the border. But, those costs don't just stay parked at the port. They ripple all the way down. Manufacturers end up paying more for imported parts, which drives up production costs. And ultimately, it's working-class households that feel the pinch when their paychecks just don't stretch as far at the checkout line. When we map out the real-world incentives here, the winners and losers become pretty obvious. On the left side, we've got the beneficiaries, protected domestic industries, and compliant foreign producers. They suddenly gain all this pricing power and market share just because their competitors got more expensive. But look over at the right side. The risk bearers are the working-class consumers and import-dependent American factories. They're the ones absorbing these higher prices and dealing with major supply chain chaos. At its core, this is a massive transfer of economic risk straight down to everyday households.
Okay, let's move on to our second topic, the dangerous escalation in the Iran war. The conflict with Iran, which actually kicked off in February 2026, has been escalating fast. And crucially, this is happening without any new specific congressional authorization. After an Iranian attack on a U.S. base in Jordan, the U.S. launched additional strikes mid-July to try and stop Iran from disrupting oil tanker traffic. The administration is enforcing a naval blockade, and this whole cycle of attacks and retaliation is just intensifying. And the human toll is frankly devastating. By July 22nd, 18 American service members were reported dead, with hundreds more wounded since this all began. And this brings us to a major second-order economic effect that hits right at home. Because this conflict centers around the Strait of Hormuz, which is basically the world's most critical oil shipping artery, energy markets are freaking out. During that week in July, the national average for regular gas surged to $4.06 a gallon. At the exact same time, the 10-year Treasury yield spiked to 4.65%. Why does that matter to us? Because higher long-term yields directly drive up your borrowing costs for things like mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards. So once again, it's working class and military families bearing the absolute heaviest burdens of this geopolitical standoff.
Meanwhile, the constitutional check on all these war powers is totally gridlocked. On July 23rd, the House did pass a resolution directing the removal of forces. But here's the catch. It was non-binding, meaning it has zero force of law. Hours later, the Senate blocked a binding version that actually would have done something. The result is a really dangerous mission lock-in. We have political opposition on paper, sure, but absolutely no enforceable congressional order to end the war. The administration says it has the authority to protect U.S. forces, while opponents are pointing to the mounting casualties and inflation happening with no clear end in sight.
Let's shift gears to Section 3 and see how civil rights enforcement is being weakened.
Looking inside the federal agencies, we're seeing a massive, coordinated retreat from data-driven civil rights monitoring. On July 23rd, the Education Department stripped the disparate impact provisions right out of its Title VI regulations. They also scrapped proactive compliance guidelines for technical education. And just a couple of days before that, on July 21st, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission proposed axing demographic reporting requirements, the same EEO-1 through EEO-6 forms that have required large employers to submit workforce race and sex data since literally 1966.
This is a monumental shift in how civil rights are tracked in America. And again, we have very clear beneficiaries and risk bearers. The big winners here, large employers. They stand to save an estimated $275 million every single year in compliance costs. But the risk bearers are the everyday workers and technical education students. You see, disparate impact rules and demographic data are basically the early warning systems we use to catch hidden systemic discrimination. Without those tools, protecting labor dignity becomes incredibly tough. It forces an individual to prove explicit, intentional discrimination after the harm has already been done, which is notoriously difficult to pull off.
Moving on to Section 4, let's talk about the contesting of FEMA election grants. So on July 23rd, a coalition of 25 states and Washington, D.C. slapped a lawsuit on the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA. The states are alleging that the administration is unlawfully holding back at least $148 million. That's about 20% of their critical Homeland Security grant program allocations. And the catch for getting that disaster preparedness money? States supposedly have to adopt the federal government's preferred election systems, which means transitioning to hand-marked paper ballots and using super stringent citizenship verification systems for voter rolls. Now, to be fair, these are just allegations in a lawsuit that is still playing out in court, but it definitely highlights a massive, legally contested effort to use federal grant money as leverage to force state-level election changes. Finally, for Section 5, we are looking at the overhaul of defense supply chains.
On July 20th, the administration signed Executive Order 14415, which makes an aggressive push to strip foreign dependencies right out of our defense acquisitions. It basically orders the Pentagon to crack down on waivers that previously allowed prohibited foreign materials into the supply chain. Now, nobody is arguing against building domestic resilience. That's a vital goal. But as this assessment right here shows, success is entirely about the sequencing. If you cut off foreign inputs before you've actually scaled up domestic production, you're going to trigger dangerous scarcity, massive production delays, and huge price spikes. You have to scale domestic capacity first if you want true resilience.
Ultimately, when you step back and look at this entire week in July, the real common thread isn't just one specific policy goal, it is executive substitution. We're watching the administration swap one tariff statute for another to sidestep a Supreme Court ruling. They are substituting unilateral war-making for congressional authorization. They're trading proactive civil rights monitoring for a complaint-driven system. These aren't just paperwork changes. They fundamentally alter the mechanics of government. They shift institutional power upward and push real-world economic and civil risks straight downward onto everyday households. When the traditional checks and balances get bypassed this effectively, it leaves us with one massive lingering thought: figuring out exactly who is left to hold these new mechanisms of power accountable.